In 2019 alone, search and rescue teams in Alaska responded to over 1,000 incidents. Yet a small percentage estimates vary between 2% and 5%, and 5% remained unresolved beyond 72 hours. This is the life story of one such system of disappearance. Not a single event, but the convergence of terrain, weather, logistics, and human limitation that shaped how groups vanish in the Alaskan backcountry and how institutions learned, slowly, to respond. It began as a problem of scale. Alaska covers more than 1.7 million square kilometers, with vast regions lacking roads, signal coverage, or permanent human presence. Any missing person event in such an environment immediately becomes a race against geography rather than time. A lesser-known fact. A core design compromise in search and rescue doctrine is the trade-off between search area size and search intensity, where expanding coverage reduces probability of detection per square kilometer. The parents of this system were not a single agency, but overlapping structures: state troopers, National Park Service units, volunteer rescue groups, and federal coordination bodies. Each brought different capabilities, but also different limitations, creating a fragmented response network that had to function as one under pressure. A lesser-known fact. Early test results of multi-agency coordination exercises in remote regions showed communication delays averaging 18 to 27 minutes due to incompatible radio systems. The first hours of any disappearance defined everything that followed. In many cases, the last known point what investigators call the LKP was uncertain, based on incomplete witness accounts or delayed reporting. This uncertainty expanded the search area exponentially with each passing hour. A lesser-known fact. Production issues in early mapping systems meant that some topographic data used in the 1990s and early 2000s had resolution errors of up to 50 meters, complicating precise location tracking. Childhood, in this context, was a period of trial and error. Early search efforts often relied heavily on ground teams moving through terrain that was physically punishing and slow to traverse. Dense forests, wetlands, and mountainous regions reduced movement speed to less than 1 kilometer per hour in some cases. A lesser-known fact, supply constraints and extended ground searches often limited teams to 48-hour operational windows before mandatory resupply. Reducing continuous coverage of critical areas, training evolves slowly. Rescuers learn to read not just maps, but of how lost individuals tend to move, how panic alters decision-making, how exhaustion changes direction and pace. These behavioral models became as important as physical tracking. A lesser-known fact. Crew training data indicates that lost individuals without navigation tools tend to travel in circles of 5 to 20 degrees deviation, often returning near their starting point without realizing it. Early misunderstandings shaped doctrine. It was once assumed that missing individuals would seek high ground or visible landmarks. In reality, many moved downhill, following water sources, which often led them deeper into inaccessible terrain. A lesser-known fact. Battlefield improvisation concepts influenced search strategies, introducing flexible grid patterns rather than rigid linear sweeps to adapt to unpredictable movement. Small changes mattered. The introduction of GPS technology improved coordination, but only where signal was available. Satellite-based communication devices began to appear, though adoption was uneven due to cost and accessibility. A lesser-known fact. Countermeasure. Development in wilderness safety includes personal locator beacons, PLBs, which, when activated, can reduce average rescue time from days to hours. Growth came through standardization. Search and rescue protocols were formalized, manuals written, and training programs expanded. The Incident Command System (ICS) became the backbone of coordination, allowing multiple agencies to operate under a unified structure. A lesser-known fact. Command doctrine shifts toward IX reduce coordination errors by measurable margins, with some studies noting up to a 25% improvement in operational efficiency. Logistics became more sophisticated. Air support, including helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, extended the reach of search operations. However, these assets were expensive and limited, requiring careful allocation, a lesser-known fact. Weather and terrain impact flight availability significantly, with helicopter operations in Alaska grounded up to 40% of the time during adverse conditions. Data collection improved. Missing person cases were analyzed collectively, identifying trends in behavior, survival rates, and environmental risks. This data informed predictive models used to prioritize search areas. A lesser-known fact: test results from survival studies show that exposure to cold environments can reduce core body temperature to dangerous levels within hours. Depending on clothing and activity, at its peak, the system of search and disappearance reached a level of intensity where entire regions could be mobilized within hours. Multiple teams, aircraft, and coordination centers operated simultaneously, each piece contributing to a larger effort. A lesser-known fact: production of specialized search equipment, such as thermal imaging devices, increased significantly after the early 2000s. Though high costs limited widespread deployment, a defining scenario often began the same way: a group of campers overdue, a delayed report, and a rapidly expanding search area. Initial efforts focused on likely routes and campsites, then expanded outward in widening patterns. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints in fuel and maintenance can limit aerial search duration, with some operations restricted to a few hours per day per aircraft. What made the system effective at its peak was not certainty, but probability. Search areas were prioritized based on likelihood, informed by data but never guaranteed. Success depended on narrowing uncertainty faster than conditions deteriorated. A lesser-known fact: countermeasure strategies in search operations include probability of area POA calculations, which assign numerical likelihoods to different regions based on available information. But there was always a cost. For those involved, search operations demanded physical endurance and mental resilience. Long hours, difficult terrain, and the constant possibility of failure created a unique form of strain. A lesser-known fact: medical studies of search and rescue personnel show elevated fatigue levels comparable to those in extended military operations. 4. The cost was immediate and severe. Exposure, dehydration, and injury reduced survival chances rapidly. Estimates vary, but survival rates dropped sharply after the first 72 hours in harsh conditions. A lesser-known fact: psychological effects of isolation and disorientation can impair decision-making within hours, leading individuals to take actions that worsen their situation. Not all searches ended in recovery. Some concluded with partial findings, others with none at all. In these cases, the system shifted from rescue to documentation, preserving what information could be gathered. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine includes transition protocols, from rescue to recovery phases, often triggered by survival probability thresholds. Over time, limitations became clearer. Despite advances in technology and coordination, certain environments remained resistant to effective search. Dense vegetation, rugged terrain, and extreme weather continued to obscure visibility and access. A lesser-known fact: weather and terrain impact detection rates significantly, with dense forest canopies reducing aerial visibility by over 90%. Replacement did not come in the form of a single solution, but through incremental improvements. Better communication devices, improved training, and more accurate data models gradually enhanced effectiveness. A lesser-known fact: design evolution in search technology often focuses on integration, combining GPS, satellite communication, and mapping into single devices. Yet the core challenge remained unchanged. The environment of Alaska imposes limits that technology can only partially overcome. Distance, isolation, and unpredictability continue to define outcomes. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints in remote regions can delay deployment of search teams by hours or even days. Depending on accessibility, the legacy of this system is not measured only in successful rescues, but in adaptation. Procedures refined, training improved, and expectations adjusted. The understanding of what is possible and what is not became more precise. A lesser-known fact: crew training programs now emphasize decision-making under uncertainty, reflecting lessons learned from past, unresolved cases. And so the story does not end with resolution. It continues in every search, every missing report, every effort to locate those who have disappeared into environments that do not easily give answers. Some systems are built to find, others are built to try. Cold exposure accounts for a significant portion of fatalities in wilderness incidents, with hypothermia able to impair cognition after core temperatures drop just 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. That physiological limit quietly defines the middle years of this system, the period where search doctrine matured not around finding people, but around understanding how quickly the human body fails in places like Alaska. By this stage, the structure around disappearance had become more organized, but also more constrained by reality. Search grids were no longer drawn simply by distance, but by time, how far a person could have traveled before fatigue, injury, or exposure reduced mobility. That shift turned maps into timelines, a lesser-known fact. Design compromise, impredictive. Modeling often forces simplification of human movement into average speeds, typically between 1.5 and 3 kilometers per hour. Despite wide variation in real conditions, standardization expanded into documentation. Manuals grew thicker, not because the environment became more predictable, but because past uncertainty was recorded in detail. Every failed search added instructions for the next one, a lesser-known fact. Production issues in large procedural manuals include version fragmentation, where field teams sometimes operate on outdated revisions due to distribution delays. Communication improved, but never fully stabilized. Radios, satellite phones, and later digital systems reduced isolation between teams. Yet signal loss remained common in valleys, forests, and mountainous terrain. Coordination still depended on redundancy. A lesser-known fact: test result studies in mountainous environments show radio signal degradation of up to 80% in deep valleys, requiring relay positioning to maintain contact. The system learned to work around its own limitations. When direct communication failed, pre-planned check-in intervals and fallback procedures ensured continuity. Silence became part of the protocol, not a breakdown of it. A lesser-known fact: battlefield improvisation techniques influenced these. Fallback systems, using pre-assigned actions triggered by miscommunication windows rather than real-time commands. Air support entered a more defined role. Helicopters were no longer used only for transport, but as primary search tools, equipped with visual and infrared systems. Yet their effectiveness depended heavily on conditions that could not be controlled. A lesser-known fact: weather and terrain impact infrared detection, with dense canopy and temperature equilibrium reducing effectiveness by more than 70% in some environments. As the system matured, it also became more selective. Not every area could be searched with equal intensity. Prioritization models determined where effort would be concentrated, often leaving large regions with minimal coverage. A lesser-known fact: countermeasure strategies in search operations include probability of detection pod calculations, which estimate the likelihood of finding a subject in a given area based on terrain and method. At its operational peak, The system functioned like a layered net. Ground teams, air units, and coordination centers operated simultaneously, each covering different aspects of the search space. The goal was to overlap multiple methods applied to the same area to increase detection chances. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints and multi-layer operations often limit overlap duration, as fuel, personnel, stamina, and equipment availability restrict sustained intensity. A defining scenario from this phase often involved delayed reporting. A group of campers fails to return, but the alarm is raised hours or days later. By then, the initial search area has expanded beyond immediate reach. A lesser-known fact: crew training emphasizes rapid information gathering in early stages, as each hour of delay can increase search area size by several square kilometers. In such cases, the system relied heavily on behavioral assumptions. Groups tend to stay together initially, but stress and disagreement can cause separation. Once separated, survival probabilities diverge sharply. A lesser-known fact: psychological studies of group survival show that cohesion often breaks down after 24 to 48 hours under stress, especially when resources become scarce. The effectiveness of the system at this stage depended on narrowing uncertainty faster than conditions worsened. Every decision where to search, how to allocate resources, was a calculation against time and environment. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine incorporates decision thresholds, where search strategies are reevaluated after set time intervals, regardless of progress. But the costs of this system became more visible as it matured. Search and rescue personnel faced cumulative fatigue, not just from single operations, but from repeated exposure to high-stress environments. Recovery time between missions was often limited. A lesser-known fact: medical data indicates that repeated deployments in physically demanding search operations can lead to chronic fatigue and increased injury risk over time. For those being searched for, the cost followed a different pattern. Initial survival chances depended on preparation, clothing, knowledge. Without these, the environment quickly imposed its limits. A lesser-known fact: test results in survival research show that proper insulation can extend survivability in cold environments by several hours to days, depending on conditions. Injury patterns became predictable. Sprains, fractures, and exhaustion often immobilized individuals, reducing their ability to signal or move towards safety. Once immobilized, detection became significantly more difficult. A lesser-known fact: countermeasure development in wilderness safety includes signaling devices such as mirrors and whistles, which can increase detection probability when used correctly. There were also less visible effects. Disorientation, panic, and cognitive decline altered behavior in ways that made prediction less reliable. Individuals sometimes moved away from search teams without realizing it. A lesser-known fact: psychological effects of hypothermia include confusion and paradoxical undressing, behaviors that significantly reduce survival chances. The system adapted by incorporating these factors into its models, but adaptation did not eliminate risk. It only made outcomes slightly more predictable. A lesser-known fact: design evolution in predictive systems often increases complexity, but also introduces new uncertainties due to variable interactions. As time passed, attention began to shift. New technologies emerged: drones, improved satellite imaging, and advanced communication devices. These promised better coverage, but also introduced new challenges of integration and costs. A lesser-known fact: production issues in emerging technologies often delayed deployment in field operations. With testing phases extending beyond initial projections, older methods were not replaced entirely. Ground searches, visual scanning, and manual tracking remained essential, especially in environments where technology struggled. A lesser-known fact: battlefield improvisation remains relevant in modern search operations as teams adapt tools and methods to immediate conditions rather than relying solely on standard procedures. The system entered a phase of partial replacement. New tools supplemented old ones, creating hybrid approaches that combine technology with human judgment. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints often limit the number of advanced devices available per operation, requiring selective deployment. Yet, even with these advancements, the fundamental challenge persisted. Alaska's environment continued to resist full coverage, leaving gaps where individuals could remain undetected. A lesser-known fact: whether in terrain, impact drone operations, with strong winds and limited battery life restricting flight duration, and range, the legacy of this system is not defined by perfection, but by refinement. Each case added data, each failure informed future efforts, and each success reinforced the value of persistence. A lesser-known fact: crew training programs increasingly incorporate simulation-based scenarios, allowing teams to practice decision-making in controlled but realistic conditions. And still, the outcome is never guaranteed. The system operates within limits of time, of resources, of human endurance. It improves, but it does not overcome entirely. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine acknowledges diminishing returns in extended searches, where additional effort yields progressively lower chances of success. What remains is a structure designed not to eliminate disappearance, but to respond to it. A system shaped by terrain, refined by experience, and defined by the understanding that some distances cannot be closed in time. Some searches end with answers. Others end with maps marked and files closed, carrying forward the same quiet uncertainty into the next call. After 5 days in subarctic conditions, survival rates without adequate shelter drop sharply, with estimates varying but often falling below 20% depending on exposure and injury. That threshold marks the point where the system begins to change. Its purpose, moving from urgency to endurance, from active search to managed uncertainty. By this stage, operations no longer expand outward with the same intensity. Instead, they contract inward, focusing on high probability zones while maintaining minimal coverage elsewhere. The map becomes quieter, but more deliberate. A lesser-known fact: design compromise in late-stage search strategy often reduces area coverage by over 50% to concentrate resources where probability of detection remains highest. Time alters not just the search, but the expectations around it. Early optimism gives way to measured realism, and language shifts accordingly from locate and recover to continue efforts as conditions allow. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine shift guidelines often formalize these language changes to align team expectations with survival probability models. Logistics begin to dominate decisions. Fuel reserves, personnel fatigue, and equipment were imposed limits that cannot be ignored. Even with willingness to continue, the system must balance sustainability against diminishing returns. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints in extended operations can reduce daily search hours by up to 30%. As resources are conserved for longer durations, the personnel experience a different kind of strain in this phase. The urgency of the first days is replaced by repetition: same terrains, same patterns, same unanswered questions. It is not intensity, but persistence that defines the workload. A lesser-known fact: medical studies show that prolonged low yield operations can lead to decreased morale and slower reaction times, even when physical fatigue is managed. At some point, the transition becomes formal. The operation shifts from Serchandriscu to Serchandrick-Sigri. It is not a single decision, but a threshold crossed gradually, often without a clear moment of change. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine establishes survival probability benchmarks, though exact values vary, to guide this transition in a structured manner. The tools remain the same, but their purpose changes. Detection is no longer about saving life, but about locating remains, evidence, or closure. The emotional weight of the work shifts accordingly. A lesser-known fact: countermeasure strategies in recovery operations include cadaver detection dogs, trained to locate human remains, even under snow or dense vegetation. Weather continues to influence outcomes, sometimes in unexpected ways. Snowfall can both obscure and preserve, covering tracks while stabilizing conditions that prevent further degradation. A lesser-known fact: weather and terrain impact preservation rates, with colder temperatures slowing decomposition significantly compared to temperate environments. Not all cases reach resolution, even in this phase. Terrain can conceal indefinitely. Waterways can carry evidence beyond search zones. Vegetation can regrow over disturbed ground within a single season. A lesser-known fact: test results in search effectiveness studies indicate that dense forest environments can reduce ground level visibility to less than 5 meters. As operations wind down, documentation becomes the final active process. Reports are compiled, data archived, and lessons extracted. The system turns inward, analyzing itself as much as the event. A lesser-known fact: production issues in documentation systems can delay final reports by months, especially when multiple agencies contribute data. The case does not disappear. It changes form. From an active operation, it becomes a record filed, referenced, and occasionally revisited. The absence remains, but it is managed differently. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints in archival systems often limit the depth of long-term data. Storage, prioritizing summary reports over raw data. Replacement, in a broader sense, is not about new technology alone. It is about new expectations. Modern systems accept that not every case will be resolved, and they are designed to function within that limitation. A lesser-known fact: designed evolution in search doctrine increasingly incorporates uncertainty as a fixed variable rather than an anomaly to eliminate. Over time, individual cases blend into larger datasets. Patterns emerge across years and regions, informing future strategies without referencing specific names or events. A lesser-known fact: crew training programs use aggregated case data to teach probabilistic thinking, reducing reliance on anecdotal experience. And yet, traces of each case remain: a coordinate in a database, a marked map, a set of decisions recorded for future review. These fragments contribute to a system that is always learning, even when it cannot resolve. A lesser-known fact: battlefield improvisation concepts continue to influence training, emphasizing adaptability when standard procedures fail. The legacy of this system is not defined by its successes alone. It is defined by its ability to continue operating despite incomplete outcomes, to search even when certainty is not possible. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine now includes explicit acknowledgement of diminishing returns, guiding when to scale back operations responsibly. There is no final moment where the system declares an end. Instead, there is a gradual withdrawal, teams reassigned, equipment stored, communication channels closed. The landscape remains unchanged, holding whatever it holds. A lesser-known fact: medical and psychological support programs for search personnel have expanded in recent years to address the long-term effects of unresolved cases. What follows is not silence, but continuation. New cases arise, new searches begin, the system resets, carrying forward the weight of previous experience without fully resolving it. A lesser-known fact: test result analyses across decades show incremental improvements in early-stage detection, but persistent challenges in late-stage recovery. And so the life of this thing, the system of disappearance and response in Alaska, does not end. It persists in cycles, shaped by terrain, refined by effort, and bounded by limits that no amount of structure has yet overcome. Some distances close quickly, others remain, measured not in kilometers, but in the space between what is known and what cannot be reached in time.